I've never been afraid of being home alone. In fact, I used to love it. The freedom to do whatever I wanted, watch whatever I wanted, eat junk food without my parents telling me otherwise. But after what happened that night, I can't sleep in an empty house without checking every closet, every shadow, and every ceiling vent first. It was a Friday night, and my parents had left that morning for a weekend trip. I was 17 at the time and had stayed home alone before, so I wasn't worried. It was just a typical evening. I ordered takeout, watched some Netflix, and eventually went up to my room to scroll through my phone before bed. Around 10 p.m., I started to get that weird feeling. You know, that uneasy sensation when something feels off, but you can't put your finger on it. At first, I ignored it, chalking it up to being alone in a big, quiet house. Then I heard it. At first, it was faint, a soft, scraping noise coming from above me. I paused my music and listened, but it stopped. I shook my head and went back to scrolling. Probably just the house settling, I told myself. But then, bang! A loud metallic thud echoed through my room. This time, it was unmistakable. It came from the air vent above my bed. I sat up, my heart hammering in my chest. The vents in our house were old, but they had never made a sound like that before. I stared at the vent, my breath caught in my throat, half expecting something to move. Silence. I told myself I was being paranoid. Maybe it was just the heating system turning on. I shook off the uneasy feeling and got up to use the bathroom. As I was washing my hands, I noticed something strange. The ceiling vent in the bathroom was slightly open. Not enough to be obvious, but I could see that one of the screws was loose, leaving a tiny gap in the vent cover. I froze, staring at it. My brain tried to rationalize it. Maybe my dad had taken it off to clean it and forgot to screw it back on properly. But then I remembered. We had central air conditioning. There was no reason for anyone to open the vents manually. That's when I heard it again. A soft, wheezing breath coming from inside the vent. I felt a chill run down my spine. My hands were shaking as I turned off the bathroom light and slowly backed out into the hallway. Then, from behind me, click, the sound of metal shifting. I turned just in time to see something that made my stomach drop. The vent cover in my bedroom was moving. I stood there, frozen in pure terror, watching as long, dirty fingers curled around the slats of the vent. They were thin, bony, covered in grime. Then, they pulled. The vent cover shifted forward, creaking loudly, as if someone inside was trying to push it open. That was all I needed to see. I sprinted down the stairs, nearly tripping over my own feet, and ran into the kitchen. I grabbed the biggest knife I could find and locked myself in the downstairs bathroom. My hands were shaking so badly that I almost dropped my phone as I dialed 911. The operator picked up, but before I could even explain, I heard something from outside the bathroom door. Thud. Then, footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps on the upstairs landing. I pressed my hand over my mouth to keep from making a sound. My body was trembling as I heard the footsteps descending the stairs. He was coming down. The 911 operator was still on the line asking me to speak, but I couldn't. I couldn't make a sound. The footsteps reached the bottom of the stairs. Then, silence. I strained my ears, trying to pinpoint where he was. Then I realized the footsteps had stopped directly outside the bathroom door. I felt tears prick at my eyes. I held my breath, gripping the knife in my hands so tightly my knuckles turned white. And then, a whisper. "Sufi, I know you're in there." I almost screamed. The voice was raspy, drawn out, like someone who hadn't spoken in weeks. Then came tapping. Light, gentle taps against the wooden door, like he was toying with me. I finally found my voice and whispered into the phone, "Please, send someone now." He's outside the door. The operator told me the police were on their way, but minutes felt like hours. The tapping stopped. Then a loud crash. The front window shattered. The footsteps disappeared, replaced by the sound of sirens in the distance. I didn't move until I heard the police pounding on the front door. When they entered the house, they found the vent cover ripped off, footprints in the dust, leading from the attic to the air ducts, and a dirty stained mattress hidden in the crawl space. And in the attic, they found something worse, a notebook. Inside, there were pages upon pages of handwritten notes. Sophie likes to listen to music before bed. Sophie, bathroom at 10:30 p.m. Sophie always leaves her window unlocked. They also found something else, a Polaroid picture of me, taken from inside my room. The police said he had most likely been living in our vents for weeks, maybe longer, watching me, learning my routine. They never caught him. To this day, I still wonder, if I hadn't heard that first noise in the vent that night, what would have happened if I had fallen asleep? Would I have woken up with him standing over me? Or worse, would I have never woken up at all? I've always considered myself a logical person. I don't scare easily. I don't believe in ghosts, demons, or any of that supernatural stuff. But what happened that night was very real. And to this day, I still don't have a rational explanation for it. It happened about a year ago when I was house sitting for my parents while they were out of town. They live in a pretty isolated area. No close neighbors, just a long stretch of woods surrounding the backyard. During the day, it's peaceful. At night, it's a different story. That night, I had been watching TV in the living room, sprawled out on the couch with a beer in one hand and my phone in the other. The house was completely silent except for the low hum of the television. At some point, I felt that weird sensation. You know, when you suddenly get the feeling that someone is watching you. I glanced at my phone. 11:17 p.m. I shook the feeling off. Probably just paranoia from being alone in a big, empty house. I took another sip of my drink and kept scrolling. Then, the backyard motion light turned on. I froze. The only way that light turns on is if something triggers it. I hesitated, then slowly turned my head toward the sliding glass door. The backyard was dimly lit by the floodlight, but I didn't see anything, at first. And then, my eyes landed on something that made my breath catch in my throat. At the tree line, about 30 feet away, a figure stood completely still. It was just standing there, not moving. I couldn't make out any details. Just a tall, dark silhouette. At first I thought maybe it was just a tree, but something felt wrong. I stared at it, my mind racing for a logical explanation. Was it an animal? A lost hiker? A prank? Then, as if it could hear my thoughts, it moved. Not walking, not running. It glided, an unnatural fluid motion, straight toward the house. I felt my stomach drop. My fight-or-flight instincts screamed at me to lock the door, but for some reason, I couldn't move. I just watched. The closer it got, the more I realized something terrifying. It had no face. There were no features, just a dark, stretched-out shape where a face should be. I finally snapped out of it and jumped up, locking the sliding door. My heart was hammering so hard I could hear it in my ears. I shut off the living room lights, hoping whoever, or whatever, this was wouldn't be able to see inside. I crouched low, peeking through the curtains. The figure was gone. My pulse was still racing, but I tried to convince myself it had just been a trick of the light. Maybe I imagined it? Then, tap, 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 tapping. Soft, rhythmic tapping on the glass. right behind me. I nearly jumped out of my skin. I turned around slowly. There it was, standing at the sliding door, face pressed against the glass. It wasn't human. I knew that now. It was too tall, too thin, and the way it stood there, motionless, except for the slow, deliberate tapping, made my skin crawl. Then, boom. It slammed its hand against the glass. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the coffee table. My mind was screaming at me to run, but my body wouldn't move. I just stood there, locked in a silent battle of terror with this thing. Then, it tilted its head, like it was studying me, grinning. Even though it had no face, I could feel it smiling. My body finally caught up with my brain, and I sprinted down the hallway, into my room, and locked the door. My hands shook as I grabbed my phone and dialed 911. "There's someone outside my house," I whispered, my voice barely audible. The operator told me to stay inside and not to engage. Then suddenly, silence. The tapping stopped. The house felt too quiet. I pressed my ear against the door, straining to hear anything. The only sound was my own breathing. Had it left? And then, the closet door creaked open. Inside my room, a slow, deliberate creak. I turned around so fast I almost dropped my phone. I could see the door moving. It was opening from the inside. At that moment, I realized something horrifying. It was never outside. It had been in the house the whole time. I bolted out of the room and ran to the front door. I didn't care if it was safe or not. I just needed to get out. The moment I unlocked the door, I heard something rushing toward me, a loud, inhuman screech. I threw the door open and ran outside. Just as I made it onto the porch, the police arrived, sirens blaring, red and blue lights flashing. The moment their headlights illuminated the house, it was gone. No sign of it. No footprints. Nothing. The police searched the property but found no evidence of a break-in. No signs of forced entry. No intruder. But they did find something. A bloody handprint smeared across the outside of my bedroom closet door, as if something had been inside it, watching me, waiting. I never went back to my parents' house alone after that. They moved a few months later, but sometimes, late at night, I still hear tapping at my window, and every time I look outside, the motion light is on. But there's nothing there. At least that's what I tell myself. It was the middle of winter. My husband was out of town for the weekend on a business trip, so I had the house to myself. Normally, I'd enjoy the peace and quiet, watch some movies, eat junk food, stay up late without anyone telling me otherwise. But that night, something felt off. I tried to ignore it. I kept the lights on in every room I entered, played music on my phone just to drown out the silence. By 11 p.m., I had settled into the couch in the living room, bundled up in a blanket with a glass of wine. The TV was on low volume, just background noise at that point. I wasn't really paying attention to it, just scrolling mindlessly through my phone. And then, I heard it. At first I thought it was the TV, a faint, distant laugh. I muted the volume. The laugh continued. It was coming from the basement. I sat up, every hair on my body standing on end. My stomach twisted into knots as I listened. It wasn't just a random noise. It was someone laughing, soft, muffled, like it was coming from beneath the floorboards. I told myself I was imagining it, that it was just the house settling. But then, knock, knock, knock. 3 slow, deliberate knocks from the basement door. I swear my heart stopped. I stared at the door, waiting, barely breathing. Then, a voice. "Come down here." My body locked up. It was a man's voice, but not just any man. It sounded exactly like my husband. My brain couldn't process it. I had just talked to my husband on the phone an hour ago. He was miles away in another city. It was impossible for him to be here. And yet, "Come down here, babe. I need to show you something." It sounded just like him, but there was something wrong with it. His voice was too slow, stretched out, like someone was mimicking him, but not getting it quite right. I felt sick. I wanted to run out of the house, but I couldn't move. Then, the doorknob turned. I screamed and grabbed my phone, running toward the front door. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely dial 911. As I pressed call, I heard a loud thud against the basement door, then another. Something slammed into the door, hard. I ran to the kitchen, grabbed the biggest knife I could find, and crouched behind the counter, my phone clutched in my other hand. The 911 operator picked up. "911, what's your emergency?" I whispered. "Someone is in my basement. They're trying to get into the house." The operator told me to stay put, and that officers were on their way. I was shaking, staring at the basement door, waiting for something to happen. And then, silence. For a few agonizing minutes, there was nothing. No knocking, no voice, just dead, suffocating silence. I started to think maybe, just maybe, whoever it was had left. Then, right as I let out a shaky breath, creak, the basement door slowly started to open. I froze. The door wasn't locked. I had been so terrified that I ran before I could even think to lock it. And now, it was opening, inches at a time. The hallway beyond it was pitch black. I gripped the knife tighter, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. And then, from the darkness of the basement, a hand slid around the edge of the doorframe. Pale, thin, fingers too long. Then, a face, or rather the shape of a face. I say shape because it wasn't right. It was distorted, like someone had taken my husband's face and stretched it, smoothed it out into something unnatural. It didn't have eyes, just two dark holes where eyes should be. And then, it spoke again. "Come down here, babe." But this time the voice was garbled, warped, like a broken recording. I lost it. I screamed and ran for the front door, just as I heard the thing's footsteps rushing toward me. I threw the door open and ran outside barefoot into the freezing night. I didn't care, I just needed to get away. That's when I saw the police car pulling up. I was shaking, crying, barely able to explain what had happened. The officers rushed inside, guns drawn. They searched the entire house, the basement, the closets, the attic. Nothing. No signs of forced entry, no footprints, no broken windows. It was like no one had ever been there. I kept insisting, "Check the basement." The voice came from the basement, and they did. What they found down there still haunts me. In the farthest corner of the basement, behind the water heater, there was a makeshift bed, an old moldy mattress, empty food wrappers, a single rusty knife. Someone had been living down there. The police searched the entire property, but whoever it was had disappeared. The worst part? When they checked the security camera footage, they saw me running out of the house. They saw the officers arrive. But the basement door, it never opened. No one came upstairs. No one was ever caught on camera. To this day, I still don't understand what happened. I moved out of that house 6 months later. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear it. That same slow voice, whispering from the shadows. "Come down here." And when I check my phone, there's always a voicemail. Just laughter, playing on a loop.